When I was 7 months pregnant, my own father shoved me down the front steps of the house I had paid for with my own money and stood over me while my belongings burned in a barrel on the lawn. I lay on the cold concrete of my driveway in Charlotte, North Carolina, one hand wrapped around my swollen belly, the other reaching toward a man who used to carry me on his shoulders. Blood from a gash above my eye dripped into the collar of my coat. My brother Bryce watched from the doorway of my house, sipping a glass of my wine, and he did not move. The same brother whose life I had saved 2 years earlier with the marrow taken from my own hip bones. They thought a fall down a few steps would silence me. They thought a girl on the ground stays on the ground. But from the stretcher they wheeled me onto that night, I had already started building the legal machine that would take everything they owned and end all three of them for good. Before I tell you the full story, the painful version, the version with every cold detail, I have one quick question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop your city and your time in the comments below. I love seeing where my global family is tuning in from. It gives me strength. And after the night I am about to describe, I needed every bit of strength I could find. Go ahead and type it now, because what comes next is going to shake you. My name is Eleanor. I am 29 years old. For as far back as my memory reaches, I was treated like a piece of furniture in my own family. Useful when something needed carrying, invisible the rest of the time, and never, not once, loved the way my brother was loved. I used to believe that if I worked harder, if I gave more, if I bled for them, they would finally see me. I learned, in the slowest and most brutal way a person can learn anything, that some people do not want your love. They want your labor, your money, and in my case, they wanted the marrow out of my bones and the deed to my house, and they were willing to put me in the hospital to get it. Charlotte is a city that runs on banks and ambition. Glass towers downtown, manicured suburbs spreading out in every direction, and a kind of polite hunger underneath all of it. I grew up about 30 minutes outside the center of it, in a tired brick house with a brown lawn and a father whose temper sat just under his skin like a wire pulled too tight. His name is Walter. My mother is Diane. And then there was Bryce, my older brother, the boy the entire household was built around. From the time I could walk, the message was clear. Bryce was the future. Bryce was the name that mattered. I was the daughter who would grow up, marry someone, and stop taking up space at the table. My mother would say it almost sweetly, the way you might describe weather. A woman's job, she told me more than once, is to hold the family together quietly, not to go chasing trophies. So I held things together quietly. I cleaned the kitchen while my mother rubbed my brother's shoulders because he was stressed about a math test he was going to fail anyway. I packed my own lunches from the age of 9. I learned to make myself small, and I told myself it was love. There is one memory from my childhood that I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since the night on the driveway. I was 10 years old and I had won first place in a regional science competition, the kind of thing that took me months of late nights to prepare. I came home with the ribbon and the certificate clutched to my chest, certain that this, finally, would be the thing that made my father proud of me. I found the whole family in the kitchen, but they were not there for me. Bryce had been cut from the junior soccer team that afternoon, and my mother was making him his favorite dinner to cheer him up, and my father was on the phone with the coach demanding a tryout for him the following week. I stood in the doorway holding my ribbon, and my mother glanced at me and said, "Not now, Eleanor. Can you not see your brother is upset?" I went up to my room and I put the ribbon in a drawer and I did not show it to anyone. I found that drawer again years later when I was packing to move into my own house, and I sat on the floor and held that old ribbon and understood, for the first time, that I had spent my entire childhood auditioning for a part that had already been given to someone else before I was even born. But I did not stay small. Underneath the obedient daughter, there was a quiet, burning engine that frightened them, though I did not understand that yet. While Bryce spent his teenage years getting suspended and crashing the cheap used cars my parents kept buying him on credit, I sat up until 3 in the morning under a single desk lamp, teaching myself everything I could get my hands on. I had no safety net. I had no trust fund. What I had was a brain, a fierce instinct for self-preservation, and a refusal to be dragged into the same dirt my family seemed so comfortable lying in. For years I played the part. I was the agreeable daughter who absorbed the gaslighting and smiled. I listened to my mother explain that my straight A report cards did not matter because a woman who chases achievement only makes her future husband uncomfortable. I watched my father throw a backyard cookout because Bryce managed to keep a job at a tire shop for 3 whole weeks, while my own acceptance into a competitive program earned me a shrug and a comment about how I always had to make everything about myself. I accepted all of it because somewhere deep down I still believed, with the painful innocence of a neglected child, that one day they would wake up and see how much I loved them. I had no idea that my love was simply the thing that made me easy to use. When I turned 18, my parents sat me down and told me plainly that they would not be paying $1 toward my education. College, my father said, was a luxury, and any spare money the family had needed to be saved for Bryce's future. Bryce had no future plans, that did not matter. So I did what I had always done. I took control of my own life. I worked the overnight shift stocking shelves and running a register at a 24-hour pharmacy near the highway, ringing up cough syrup and cigarettes until 4 in the morning. And then I dragged my exhausted body to my morning classes. I barely slept for 4 years. I lived on black coffee, dry cereal, and pure willpower. I held a perfect grade average and earned a full scholarship that covered my tuition and every other cost, my books, my rent in a cramped room with 2 other girls, my food, came straight out of my own pocket. That pharmacy job turned into something. I learned the work, I learned the systems, I outlasted everyone, and by the time I graduated, I had clawed my way into a real career in hospital pharmacy. Within a few years, I was running a department, director of pharmacy for a large hospital system in Charlotte, responsible for millions of dollars in medication and a staff of dozens. My salary climbed into the low 6 figures and then kept climbing. For the first time in my life, I was not surviving, I was building something. And the moment my parents understood that I had money, the fangs came out. It started small, the way these things always do. My mother would call me crying, telling me the power was about to be shut off, that my father's truck had blown a transmission, that they were behind on the mortgage and too proud to tell anyone but me. Every single month, like a bill arriving in the mail, the number was somewhere around $1,500. If I hesitated even a little, my father would get on the phone and scream that I was an ungrateful, selfish girl who had forgotten the people who raised her. So I paid month after month, year after year. I quietly wired money into the account of a family that openly preferred my brother to me. I funded a lazy man's lifestyle while I walked to work in the rain because I refused to spend on myself what I was sending to them. And then, 3 years ago, the thing happened that should have bought me their loyalty forever. Bryce got sick. It came on fast. He was tired all the time, then he was bruising for no reason. Then he collapsed at a friend's apartment and woke up in an emergency room. The word the doctors used was leukemia, the kind that moves quickly, the kind that needs a marrow transplant, and needs it from a matched donor, or the patient does not survive. The whole family was tested. My parents were not close enough matches. The donor registry turned up nothing in time, and then the results came back on me. I was a near perfect match. Out of everyone on this earth, I was the one who could save my brother's life. I did not hesitate for even a second. Whatever they had done to me, whatever they had withheld, I was not going to let my brother die when I held the cure inside my own bones. I took unpaid leave from a job I had fought my whole life to earn. I went through weeks of injections that made my bones ache like they were splitting open from the inside, drugs that forced my marrow to overproduce so they could harvest it. On the day of the donation, they took me into surgery and pulled the marrow directly from the back of my pelvis, both sides, with long needles, while I lay under anesthesia. I woke up unable to walk without help. For 2 weeks, I could barely climb a flight of stairs. My hips throbbed for over a month. I have small scars on my lower back to this day that I can still feel when I press on them. The recovery was lonely in a way that is hard to describe. I had imagined, in some childish corner of my mind, that giving so much of myself for my brother would finally pull the family around me. I pictured my mother bringing me soup, my father carrying my bags, the 3 of them sitting at my bedside the way they had sat at his. None of that happened. My mother visited me exactly once during the worst of my recovery, and she spent most of the visit on the phone with Bryce's nurse, asking about his progress, while I lay in the next room barely able to roll onto my side without crying out. When she left, she told me to get some rest and to let her know when I was feeling well enough to start sending money again, because the bills did not stop just because I had a procedure. I remember staring at the ceiling for a long time after the door closed and feeling something I did not have a name for yet, a kind of grief for a thing that had never actually existed. My friends from work were the ones who showed up. They rotated, bringing me meals and checking that I was taking my medication and helping me to the bathroom in the first few days when I could not manage the distance alone. A coworker I barely knew drove 40 minutes to bring me groceries because she heard I had no one. Strangers practically treated me with more tenderness in 2 weeks than my own blood had managed in 27 years. I told myself at the time that it did not matter, that I had done it for Bryce and not for thanks. That was true. But it is also true that a person can do a thing for the right reason and still be quietly destroyed by the silence that follows it. It worked. The transplant took. Bryce's body accepted my marrow, and slowly, over many months, he recovered. The doctors called it a textbook success. They told my parents in front of me that without me, their son would be dead. I remember standing in that hallway, still pale and aching, waiting for my mother to turn and take my hands, and finally say the words I had wanted my whole life. "Thank you, we see you. We love you." She turned to a nurse and asked when Bryce could have real food again. That was the moment, if I am honest, that something inside me went quiet, not angry yet, just quiet, the way a house goes quiet when the power is cut. I had given my brother the inside of my own bones, and the cost of it had not earned me so much as a soft look. But I was still soft myself back then. I told myself they were overwhelmed, that the gratitude would come once the fear of losing him faded. I kept waiting for it. I am still, in some small way, waiting for it now. What I did not understand, what it took me far too long to understand, is that in my family a gift is never received as a gift. It is filed away as proof that you owe them more. By saving Bryce's life, I had not earned their love. In their twisted accounting, I had simply admitted that his life was worth more than mine, and that I existed to keep him alive. They would remind me of that later in the worst possible way. They would actually stand in my own home and tell me that, because I had given him my marrow, I now owed him a roof. Because a sister who has already given her bones cannot pretend a house is too much to ask. It was during Bryce's recovery that I met Marcus. He came into my life sideways, the way the best things do. We met at a charity event the hospital threw, the kind of evening where everyone wears name tags and pretends to enjoy lukewarm chicken. Marcus was there representing his firm. He was a real estate attorney, the sort who spends his days deep in deeds, titles, contracts, and property disputes, and who can read the fine print of a thing, the way most people read a road sign. He was tall, calm, and almost unnervingly steady. And when I told him a little about my family, just a little, he did not make a joke and he did not look away. He listened the way a person listens when they are already deciding to protect you. Marcus was everything my family was not. Supportive, fiercely loyal, and incapable of being charmed by people he did not respect. We married a little over a year and a half ago in a small ceremony with about 30 guests. My parents came. They sat in the second row and barely smiled, and my mother spent the reception inspecting the other women's jewelry with envy in her eyes. Marcus saw all of it. He watched the way my father only spoke to me when he wanted something, the way my mother's compliments always had a hook buried in them. More than once, Marcus held my hand and told me gently that they did not love me, that they loved my paycheck, and that I deserved a family that did not bleed me. He never demanded I cut them off. He just made it clear that whenever I was ready to stop walking back into that fire, he would be standing right there. I was not ready. I was still desperate for their approval, still convinced that one more sacrifice, one more month of payments, one more favor would finally tip the scales. So I kept handing them my time, my money, and eventually my home. Here is the part of the story I need you to understand, because everything that happened later turns on it. About 2 years ago, before the wedding, I bought a house. Not an enormous house, a solid 2-story brick home in a quiet, leafy neighborhood on the east side of Charlotte, with a wide front porch and a maple tree in the yard that turned the color of fire every October. I paid for it entirely with my own money. The down payment came from my own savings, every dollar of it earned at that overnight pharmacy job and the career I built from it. The mortgage was in my name alone, and I paid every single installment myself, on time. For 2 years, the deed had my name on it and no one else's. After Marcus and I married, he moved in with me, but the house was mine legally and completely, the first thing in my entire life that belonged only to me. That house was not just walls and a roof, it was the proof, in brick and glass, that the small, invisible girl who packed her own lunches had built a life no one had handed to her. On the day I got the keys, I sat alone in the empty living room on the bare floor and cried until I had nothing left. I did not know then that the same family who never thanked me for my marrow would look at that house, the one thing that was finally and only mine, and decide that it should be theirs. The trap began to close around 6 months ago, and like every trap my family ever set, it was disguised as a favor I would feel guilty for refusing. By then, Bryce had made a full recovery, and a recovered Bryce was somehow worse than a sick one. He had spent 2 years being treated like a miracle, the boy who came back from the edge, and he wore it like a crown. He never finished anything, never held a job longer than a season, and never once acknowledged whose marrow was keeping him upright. That spring he got engaged to a woman named Sienna. Sienna came from a family with more appearance than money, and she had the particular talent of measuring a room by the cost of what was in it. She and Bryce wanted to marry quickly, and they wanted, more than anything, to look like the kind of young couple who had already arrived, even though between the two of them they could barely cover a phone bill. The phone call came on a Sunday. My mother's voice was syrup. "Eleanor," she said, "your brother and Sienna are getting married, and they have nowhere decent to live, and you have that big, beautiful house with all that empty space. Could they just stay with you for a little while, just until they find their feet?" I hesitated. Something in me, the part that had been learning for 29 years, pulled back. But then my father got on the line, and he did not yell this time. He did something worse. He said, in a low, wounded voice, "After everything this family has been through, after we almost lost your brother, you are going to tell him he cannot have a roof over his head. You gave him your marrow, Eleanor. Do not tell me a few rooms are too much." There it was, the marrow, weaponized. The very gift I had given out of love turned into a debt I could never finish paying. I told them yes. Marcus was against it from the first word. He told me quietly and seriously that people who feel entitled to your home do not leave it the way they found it, and that I should, at minimum, put the terms in writing. I told him I was overthinking it. They were my family. It would be a few weeks. I will spend the rest of my life grateful that the one thing I did not ignore was his advice to keep every document, every record, every receipt about that house exactly where I could find it. Bryce and Sienna moved in with 2 carloads of belongings and a moving truck of furniture, which should have been my first warning. People do not bring a sofa for a few weeks. Within a month, they had taken over the entire second floor and half the first. Sienna rearranged my kitchen and threw out dishes she found ugly. Bryce parked his car in front of mine in the driveway as if he owned the pavement. My parents started coming by constantly, and then they started staying. First for dinner, then for the weekend, then for stretches I lost count of. My own home began to feel like a place I was visiting. When I asked gently how the apartment search was going, the answers got vague, then irritated, then hostile. Sienna told me to my face that I had no idea how hard it was for normal people, as if the woman who had paid for the roof over her head had simply been handed it. I would learn later from documents and from sworn testimony exactly what they had been planning while they sat at my table eating food I bought. They had decided that the house was going to become theirs. And they had decided it together. The plan was simple and vicious. They would establish that Bryce and Sienna lived there, build up months of residence, and then claim that I had given them the house, that there had been a verbal agreement, a gift between family made out of gratitude because Bryce had nearly died. My father had even found a man, a sloppy notary who owed him a favor, willing to put his stamp on a fabricated document that described a transfer of the property I had never agreed to and never signed. They believed that if they pushed me out and dug in, the law would let possession win. They believed I was still the small girl who would rather lose everything than make a scene. Meanwhile, I was changing in a way none of them noticed. I was pregnant. Marcus and I had found out in the early winter, and by the time everything came apart, I was 7 months along, carrying a daughter. I was tired all the time. My back ached, my feet swelled. I moved slowly through a house that was no longer mine in any way that mattered, And I kept telling myself that once the baby came, once they saw the baby, the family would soften. I was, even then, still hoping. I cannot tell you how much I hate that I was still hoping. The night it all broke open was supposed to be a celebration. My parents announced they were hosting a dinner at my house in my dining room to honor Bryce and Sienna's upcoming wedding, and in my father's words, to celebrate the family being whole again. About 20 people were invited. Sienna's parents drove in. There were caterers in my kitchen and string lights my mother had hung across my porch without asking. Marcus was not there when it started. He had been pulled into an emergency closing across town, a property deal that had gone sideways, and he texted me that he would be there the second it wrapped. I told him to take his time. I had no idea I was about to need him more than I had ever needed anyone. I had spent the early evening upstairs lying down because at 7 months pregnant, a loud party drains you fast. Around 8 in the evening, I came downstairs to find my belongings, my clothes, my books, framed photographs from my own life, stacked in cardboard boxes by the front door. For one confused moment, I thought someone was helping me organize. Then I saw my father standing in the front hall with a folder of papers, and I saw the locksmith's van pulling out of my driveway, and I understood that they had changed the locks on my house while I rested upstairs in it. I walked up to my father and asked him, as calmly as my hammering heart would let me, what was going on. He did not lower his voice. He wanted the whole party to hear. He told me that the family had talked and that the house was Bryce's now, that I had given it to him after the transplant out of love and was now pretending otherwise, and that it was time for me and my husband to find our own place. He held up the folder as if it were proof of anything. Sienna stood at the bottom of the stairs with her arms crossed and a smile like a knife. Bryce leaned in the doorway of my own living room, drinking my wine, watching me like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. My blood went cold and then hot. I told him, my voice shaking but rising, that this was my house, that the deed was in my name, that I had paid every dollar of the mortgage myself, and that I had never given anyone anything. I told him to open the door and let me get my phone, which was charging in the kitchen, so I could call my attorney, who happened to be my husband, and end this lie in 5 minutes. That was the wrong thing to say in front of Sienna's parents, the people my family was desperate to impress. The mention of an attorney cracked the performance. My mother appeared from the dining room, grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise it, and pulled me toward the front door, hissing that I was not going to humiliate this family on the most important night of Bryce's life. Bryce stepped close and muttered something into my father's ear, and I caught the end of it. She is going to ruin everything, he said. She is going to call the police and tell Sienna's parents we are frauds. Whatever was left of my father's control snapped. He had spent 2 years being told his son was a miracle and his daughter was a checkbook, and the idea that the checkbook might fight back lit something monstrous in him. He grabbed the boxes of my belongings and shoved them out onto the porch, and then he took the whole stack of them and threw them down onto the lawn, where someone had a metal fire barrel going for the cold evening, and a few of my papers and a framed photograph went straight into the flames. He turned and put both hands on my chest and on my shoulders and pushed me hard backward through the open front door. I want you to understand that he could see I was pregnant. There was no missing it. I was 7 months along and my belly was the size of a basketball under my dress. He pushed me anyway. My heels caught the lip of the threshold and there was nothing behind me but the 4 concrete front steps and the driveway below. I went down backward. I did not even have time to get my hands behind me. My shoulder and my hip hit the edge of the steps. My head clipped the iron railing and opened a gash above my eyebrow, and then I landed on the cold concrete of my own driveway with my whole weight and the weight of my child coming down at once. A white blinding pain tore across my lower belly and around into my back, the kind of pain that does not feel like an injury so much as a warning siren going off in every cell of your body. I lay there, blood ran down into my eye. My hands flew to my stomach, and the contractions started sharp and wrong and far too early, gripping me and letting go and gripping me again. My daughter, I thought, not yet, please, not yet. I tried to scream for help, and what came out was something I did not recognize as my own voice. I looked up, begging, and I saw the thing that finally killed the last warm hope I had been carrying my whole life. No one came down the steps. My mother stood in the doorway and pulled Sienna back by the elbow, telling her in a low, urgent voice to step inside, that the blood would get on her dress, that they did not need to be part of whatever Eleanor was doing now. My father stood over me, breathing hard, and then he turned to the stunned faces of the guests and said, loud and smooth, that I had tripped, that I was clumsy in my condition, that everyone had seen it, and that I was always so dramatic. Bryce, the brother whose life I carried inside my own bones, slid the new house key into his pocket and looked at me on the ground with no more feeling than you would give a spill someone else would clean up. They were going to leave me there, on the driveway of the house I had bought, bleeding, in early labor, surrounded by people who shared my blood and would not lift a hand. The physical pain was enormous, but the thing that broke open inside me was colder than pain. It was the final total understanding that there had never been anything to earn. There was no amount of money, no sacrifice, not even the marrow out of my own bones, that would ever make these people love me, because they did not love, they consumed. And then, somewhere in that haze, my tears stopped. The grief I had carried for 29 years burned off like fog in the sun, and what was left underneath it was a cold, clear, steady fury. I lay on my own driveway with my hands around my unborn daughter, and I made her a silent promise. We are going to live through this night, I told her without speaking. And the people who did this are never going to know a free and easy day again for as long as they live. There was one person at that party who was not a monster. My cousin Naomi, my aunt's daughter, the one relative who had always quietly been kind to me, had come outside when she heard the commotion. She took one look at me on the ground, bleeding and seizing with contractions, and she did not waste a single second on my parents. She knelt beside me, pressed her own scarf to the wound on my head, and with her other hand she called my husband, and then she called for an ambulance. I heard her voice break as she told Marcus to get to the house right now, that they had hurt me, that I was bleeding and the baby was coming. Then she stayed on her knees on that cold concrete with me, holding my head, telling me to breathe, while my own mother watched from the warm doorway and worried about a dress. The next several minutes blurred into sirens and flashing light. But I remember the moment Marcus arrived because the whole night seemed to crack in half around it. He had been only a few minutes away when Naomi called, and he drove like a man possessed. His car did not so much park as arrive sideways in front of the house. He came across that lawn at a dead run, and when his eyes found me on the driveway, bleeding, surrounded by people who had not bothered to kneel, a sound came out of him that I had never heard from any human being, a low, broken roar of pure devastation and rage. He dropped to his knees beside me, pulled off his jacket, and pressed it to my head, and he kept saying my name, telling me to stay with him, to look at him, that he had me, that help was coming. Behind him, 2 patrol cars from the Charlotte police had pulled up, called by the same dispatcher Naomi had reached, and right behind them came the ambulance. Paramedics swarmed me, cut away part of my dress, strapped a monitor across my belly, and went still for one terrible second listening for my daughter's heartbeat. Then one of them nodded at another, and I let myself breathe because a nod meant a heartbeat, and a heartbeat meant she was still fighting. My father, who moments earlier had thrown a pregnant woman down a flight of steps, transformed instantly into a grieving, helpful patriarch. He stepped toward the officers with his hands open and his voice trembling in a way that almost impressed me. It was a terrible accident, he told them. My daughter is pregnant and clumsy. She lost her footing on the steps. We were all just about to call for help ourselves. He gestured at the boxes on the lawn as if they proved his innocence rather than his guilt. My mother dabbed at dry eyes. Sienna's parents stood at the edge of the porch, pale and uncertain, watching a family they had wanted to marry into come apart on the grass. Marcus rose to his feet slowly. He is well over 6 feet tall, and he stood up to his full height in front of my father, and looked down at him with an expression I will never forget because it was not hot anger. It was cold, total, and certain. He told my father very quietly to stop talking. Then he turned to the officers and told them 3 things that ended the lie on the spot. He told them his name and that he was a licensed real estate attorney. He told them that the house they were all standing in front of belonged to me solely, that the deed and the mortgage were in my name alone, and that he could produce every document within the hour. And then he pointed up to the small dark eye of the camera mounted in the doorbell, and to a second camera under the eave of the porch that I had installed myself a year earlier and forgotten about, and he told them that every second of what had happened on that porch and those steps had been recorded, and that the footage was already saved to a cloud account that no one in that house could touch. I watched the color drain out of my father's face. He looked up at that little camera as if it were the eye of God. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Bryce, who had been quietly drifting toward the side gate, found his path blocked by one of the officers, who rested a hand on his arm and asked him to stay where he was. The whole performance, the whole carefully built lie about the clumsy daughter and the family being whole, collapsed in the space of a single breath. Before the paramedics loaded me into the ambulance, Marcus climbed in beside me, and just before the doors closed, he looked back at my father, my mother, and my brother standing on the lawn in the flashing red and blue light, and he said something to them in a voice low enough that only the people close could hear, and steady enough that every word landed like a stone. "You did not just break the law tonight," he told them. "You tried to kill my wife and my child over a house that was never yours. Hear me clearly. I am going to spend every dollar I have and every connection I have, and I am going to make sure the three of you lose everything and then lose your freedom. Your lives, as you know them, ended on this driveway." Then the doors closed, the siren rose, and we pulled away into the Charlotte night, through the back window of the ambulance. As we turned out of the neighborhood, I watched two officers walking toward my father with handcuffs already out. I watched Sienna's parents climb into their car and leave without a word to anyone, the engagement dying right there on the pavement, the way Bryce had spent every day terrified it would. I did not feel triumph yet. I was in too much pain for that, but I felt something settle in my chest, something hard and final, and I let it settle. The hospital was a battle. My blood pressure was falling, and the monitors showed my daughter's heart rate dropping and recovering in a pattern that made the doctors move fast and stop explaining things to me. Within 20 minutes of arriving, I was being prepped for an emergency cesarean section under general anesthesia. The last thing I remember is Marcus's hand squeezing mine and a mask coming down over my face, and a single thought, fierce and clear, that I would wake up and my daughter would be alive, because I had not survived everything I survived to lose her on a driveway. I woke up hours later in a recovery room with my throat raw and my whole body aching, and the first thing I saw was Marcus, asleep, sitting up in a chair with dark circles under his eyes and his hand still wrapped around mine. When he felt me stir, he jerked awake, and before I could even form a question, he was smiling through tears and telling me she was alive. Our daughter had been born early, just under 5 pounds, tiny enough to fit in two cupped hands, and she was in the neonatal unit hooked to monitors and a small tube to help her breathe. But she was breathing, her heart was strong, she was, the nurse said, a fighter. And Marcus laughed and cried at the same time and said, "Of course she is." Look at her mother. I held my daughter for the first time the next day, all 4 pounds and some ounces of her, warm against my chest, her tiny hand closing around one of my fingers. And in that moment, holding the child they had nearly killed, the soft, hopeful girl I had been my entire life, finished dying, and the woman who replaced her was calm and clear and absolutely without mercy. I did not cry for my family. I did not feel the old pull to forgive, to smooth things over, to keep the peace. I felt only one thing. They had tried to take my home, and they had nearly taken my child, and now they were going to learn in detail exactly who they had spent 29 years underestimating. While I was still healing from major surgery, Marcus and I met with the district attorney's office, right there in my hospital room. The defense lawyers my parents had scraped together were already calling Marcus's firm, frantic, begging for a meeting to discuss a settlement, a reduction of charges, anything to keep the family out of prison. They wanted me to sign an affidavit saying I would not press charges, calling the whole thing a private family misunderstanding, a fall, an overreaction by an emotional pregnant woman. I read their messages from my hospital bed with my daughter sleeping in a clear bassinet beside me, and I looked the district attorney in the eye and told her to give them nothing. Press every charge the law allowed to the maximum, with no deals. And then I let the machine run. First came the criminal charges, and they were heavy. The footage from my own cameras showed my father putting both hands on a visibly pregnant woman and shoving her backward down a flight of concrete steps. In North Carolina, that is not a family squabble. It is assault inflicting serious bodily injury, elevated by the fact that the victim was obviously pregnant, and the injury caused premature birth and a wound that required stitches, and the prosecutor charged my father with a serious felony, carrying the possibility of many years in state prison. Next came the fraud. My father and Bryce had paid a notary to stamp a fabricated document claiming I had transferred my house to my brother, a deed I had never signed and an agreement that had never existed. That is forgery and attempted real estate fraud, and because the value of the property was well over $200,000, it qualified as a felony of its own. The notary dragged in and questioned folded within an hour and admitted everything in exchange for a lesser charge, and his admission buried Bryce and my father both. Bryce was charged with forgery, conspiracy, and the unlawful attempt to take possession of a home that was never his. For my mother, the prosecutor filed charges for her role as an accomplice, for helping orchestrate the eviction, and then trying to cover up the assault, pulling Sienna inside and worrying about a dress while her daughter bled in early labor on the concrete. The footage of that moment, my mother choosing a dress over my life, played worse in a courtroom than any words I could have said. But the criminal courts were only one front. I wanted them to feel, in their bank accounts and in their daily lives, the exact financial ruin they had spent decades inflicting on me without a second thought. I started with the house. Bryce and Sienna were still living in it, still believing some version of their lie might hold. It did not, because the deed and the mortgage were mine, and because there had never been any transfer. They were not residents and they were not owners. They were people occupying a home that did not belong to them against the will of the lawful owner. My attorney filed for their removal, and this time the full weight of the law was on my side of the door. Within weeks, the same brother who had thrown my belongings on the lawn watched his own belongings and Sienna's furniture, and every box they had hauled in, carried out, and set on the curb by the order of a court. They were out. The house was mine again, exactly as it had always legally been. I went back to that house alone the first morning after they were gone, before Marcus and the baby came home from the hospital follow-up, because I needed to see it by myself. I stood in the driveway where I had lain bleeding, and I made myself look at the concrete steps, at the iron railing that had opened my forehead, at the patch of lawn where my father had thrown my belongings into a fire barrel. Then I walked up those same steps, slowly, one hand on the railing, and I let myself in with my own key into my own home, and I stood in the front hall and listened to the silence. The house smelled like strangers. Sienna had left half of her things behind in her hurry, and there were rings on my coffee table from glasses set down without coasters, and someone had taken down the photographs of my own family that I kept on the mantel and stuffed them in a closet. I spent that whole day cleaning, scrubbing every surface they had touched, taking back every room one at a time, and by the evening it smelled like my house again, and I sat in the living room on the floor in the exact spot where I had cried with joy the day I got the keys, and I cried again. But it was a different kind of crying. The brother I had saved tried to reach me exactly once before his trial. He sent a letter through his public defender, and the letter did not contain an apology. It contained an explanation. He wrote that he had been overwhelmed, that the wedding had put pressure on him, that our parents had pushed the whole plan and he had simply gone along with it, that he had never meant for me to get hurt, and that surely, after everything, after the marrow, I would not really let his own sister send him to prison. He signed it, "Your brother Bryce," as if the word brother still carried weight after he had stood in my doorway drinking my wine while I bled on the driveway. I read it twice, then I gave it to the prosecutor, because the line about our parents pushing the plan was, accidentally, a confession that there had been a plan at all, and it helped bury all three of them. He had spent his whole life believing the word brother was a key that opened any door in my heart. He learned far too late that he had broken the lock himself. The defense lawyers kept calling right up until the end. In one of the last attempts, they offered, on my parents' behalf, to sign over what little they had left and to publicly apologize, in exchange for me asking the court for leniency. They framed it as healing, as keeping the family together, as the kind of forgiveness a good daughter shows. I told my attorney to send back a single line. I told him to write that the family the prosecution was protecting was a woman and her daughter, and that the woman had no further interest in protecting the people who had tried to kill them. I never heard from them again until the day of the sentencing when I watched them on a screen in matching orange. Then I cut every financial artery I had kept open for that family for over a decade. For years, I had quietly paid for things they pretended they handled themselves. I had been covering the lease on the small rental house my parents lived in, under an account they did not control. I broke that lease and stopped the payments, and a corporate eviction notice went up on their door while they were sitting in a county jail unable to afford the bail my husband's lawyers had argued, successfully, should be set high. I closed the cell phone plan I had been paying for all three of them. I shut down the credit cards they had opened in my name years earlier, the ones I had been quietly absorbing out of guilt, and I reported every one of them. I canceled the insurance policies, the streaming accounts, the small automatic payments that I now realized had been keeping their entire lives afloat. For my whole life, they had treated me as a machine that dispensed money on demand. So I did the simplest, most devastating thing I could do. I reached over and switched the machine off, and I left them in the dark and the cold and the debt they had always assumed was someone else's problem. What surprised me in the doing of it was how little of it felt like revenge and how much of it felt like simple correction. Every payment I stopped was a payment I should never have been making. Every account I closed was an account that should never have existed in my name. I was not reaching out to harm them so much as withdrawing the parts of myself I had let them live on for over a decade. When you have spent your whole life as the foundation holding up a house full of people who despise you, the most powerful thing you can do is not to push the house down. It is to simply step out from underneath it and let it discover, all on its own, that it was never able to stand without you. They had told me my whole life that I was nothing, that I was a burden, that Bryce was the one who mattered. The collapse that followed the moment I stepped away was the most honest answer to that lie that I could ever have given them. By the time the court dates arrived, my father, my mother, and my brother had no money, no home, no phones, and no private attorneys. They were assigned an overworked public defender who looked, on the video screen, as though he had given up on the case before it began. The arrogant family that had stepped over my bleeding body to protect a lie was gone. What was left were three frightened people in county jumpsuits who had finally run out of someone to drain. About 6 months after the night on the driveway, the day of judgment finally came. I refused to breathe the same air as them, and I would not bring my newborn daughter anywhere near them. So the judge allowed me to appear and give my statement over a secure video link. I sat in the sunlit living room of my own house, the house that had always been mine and was mine again, with my healthy daughter sleeping against my chest and Marcus beside me holding my hand, and I watched the courtroom on my screen. When the camera panned to the defense table, my heart did not so much as flutter. The three people sitting there were almost unrecognizable. Gaunt, pale, in matching orange jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles chained. My father, who had thrown me down concrete steps, would not lift his eyes. My mother stared at her own hands. Bryce, the brother whose life I had saved with the marrow from my own bone, sat slumped and empty, finally understanding that this time no one was coming to save him, because the only person who had ever saved him was the woman he had helped throw onto a driveway. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly into the camera. With a calm, even voice that did not shake once, I laid out 29 years. The favoritism, the money taken every month under threat, the marrow I had given freely, and the gratitude I had never received. And then the night itself, the locks changed while I rested upstairs. My belongings burned on the lawn, my father's hands on my chest, the steps, the concrete, the blood, the early labor, and my mother choosing a dress. I did not raise my voice once. I did not have to. The prosecution then played the footage from my own cameras, the clear recording of my father shoving a pregnant woman down the steps and standing over her, and the recording of my mother pulling Sienna inside to protect a dress while I bled. The courtroom went completely silent. On my screen, I watched my mother bury her face in her chained hands and begin to sob, and I watched Bryce stare at the floor as the last of his denial died. The judge showed no mercy, and I had asked for none. My father was sentenced to many years in state prison for the assault on a pregnant woman that caused the premature birth of my child. Bryce was sentenced to a term of years for the forgery, the conspiracy, and the attempted theft of my home. My mother was given a felony conviction, a period of supervised probation, and a record that would follow her for the rest of her life, leaving her, at her age, without money, without a home, and unable to secure a loan or a respectable job ever again. I did not wait to watch them led away in chains. I simply reached over and tapped my laptop closed, and the screen went dark, and I cut all three of them out of my life in a single quiet motion. The silence that filled my home after that laptop closed was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, I did something I had never allowed myself to do in 29 years. I rested. I let Marcus take care of me. I sat on the wide front porch of my house with my daughter and watched the maple tree begin to turn, and I did not pick up the phone every time it rang with a knot in my stomach, because the people who had spent my whole life turning that knot were gone. I had the locks changed again, this time by a locksmith I chose, and I had the cameras upgraded. And the first night I slept in that house knowing no one could let themselves in and rearrange my life. I slept for 10 hours straight for the first time since I was a teenager. Naomi and I grew closer than we had ever been. She had risked the wrath of the entire family by kneeling beside me on that driveway, and she had testified calmly and clearly about what she saw, even though it meant being cut off by the relatives who had sided with my parents. I made sure she knew she would never be alone for it. She became my daughter's godmother. She comes for dinner every week now, and she holds the baby while Marcus and I cook. And sometimes I look across my kitchen at the two of them laughing, and I think about how a real family is not the one you are assigned at birth, but the one that shows up when you are bleeding on the concrete and chooses to stay. There were practical things to finish, too. I worked with my attorney to make sure the fraudulent document my father and brother had created could never resurface to cloud the title of my home, and I had the property records reviewed and cleared so that the deed stood exactly as it always should have, in my name and no one else's. I also quietly sought out the videographer's footage and the police records and had everything preserved, not because I expected to need it again, but because I had learned a hard lesson about what people will claim when they think no one can prove otherwise. I would never again be the woman whose truth was just her word against theirs. People sometimes ask me whether I feel guilt, whether I lie awake thinking about my mother in her small rented room with a felony record, or my father in a state prison cell, or my brother, the boy whose life I saved, sitting in a place he will not leave for years. The honest answer is no. For a long time I thought that the absence of guilt would feel cold, that I would have to harden myself into someone unrecognizable to live without it. It did not feel cold at all. It felt like setting down a backpack full of stones I had been carrying up a mountain since before I could remember. They made their choices on that driveway, in full view of a camera, with my pregnant body in front of them, and the consequences that followed were not cruelty on my part. They were simply the weight of their own actions, finally landing on the people who committed them, instead of on me. And in all of that quiet, there were no phones ringing with a manufactured emergency. No demand for $1,500, no voice telling me that my achievements did not matter, that a woman's place was to serve, that I owed them the inside of my own bones. Just my daughter's soft breathing against my chest, and the afternoon light coming through the windows of a house that no one would ever take from me again. I want to tell you what I learned because I think it is the only thing in this whole story worth carrying out of it. For 29 years, I believed that if I gave enough, I would finally be loved. I gave them my childhood. I gave them my money. I gave them, quite literally, the marrow from inside my bones to keep my brother alive. And none of it ever moved them because love was never the currency they dealt in. You cannot buy affection from people who see you as a resource. You can only stop letting them spend you. Blood did not make those people my family. Walter, Diane, and Bryce shared my blood, and they tried to kill me over a house. Marcus, who held my hand through a cesarean section, and Naomi, who knelt on cold concrete and pressed her own scarf to my head, and my daughter, who fought her way into the world at under 5 pounds and lived. They are my family. Family is built out of respect, loyalty, and love, and not one drop of it runs automatically through blood. I am safe now. I am healthy. My daughter is thriving, growing bigger and louder and more stubborn every single day, and when she is old enough, I will teach her the one lesson it took me my whole life to learn, that she never has to earn her place in the heart of anyone who truly loves her. Karma did not simply find my family. I tracked it down, I built it with my own hands, and I delivered it to their door, the same way they once handed me a list of debts I never owed. But before you go, I want to ask you something, because I think about it still. Do you believe I did the right thing, sending my own parents and the brother whose life I saved to prison, and cutting them out of my life completely? Or should a person forgive the people who share her blood no matter what they do? If you had been lying on that driveway, bleeding, with everyone you grew up with stepping over you, what would you have done? Tell me honestly in the comments below. I read every single one. And if my story meant something to you, if it reminded you that walking away from people who only know how to take is not cruelty but survival, then please subscribe and tap the bell and come back tomorrow, because I have many more stories to share, and I would love for you to be part of this family, the real kind, the kind we choose.